Welcome to the Trish and Sarah Wrestling Podcast. I'm Sarah.
I'm Trish.
And this is our podcast. We talk about wrestling news and various topics from different promotions, primarily AEW, but also New Japan Pro Wrestling, WWE, and topics from around the wrestling world. Whatever we find interesting, and we hope you will too. We are a proud member of the Social Suplex Podcast Network, and you can find our content on our podcast feed, the Social Suplex Podcast feed, as well as on Twitter and YouTube. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and rate our podcast. Today is Sunday, September 29th, 2024, and as we kick off, we are going to do a little bit of business first, which we rarely do, but some of you are aware that the Chopped Tees has started a collaboration with the Social Suplex Podcast Network, and that includes merchandise for the Trish and Sarah Wrestling Podcast, which is extremely cool. We are super excited about it. So if you are interested in checking out our Chopped Tees store, please feel free to go to Chopped, CHOPPED, dash or hyphen tees, TEES, / social suplex. We'll also tweet this. I'll put another link out on Tuesday, and we hope you will take a look. And yeah, it's weird to have merch, but it's also extremely cool. I don't want to oversell it.
No, it is weird, and it is really cool. And Dickie did an incredible job over at Shop Tees, because we have, between us, I don't know if we have one creative bone in our body. You probably have one, I have none. So we were very, very grateful for basically someone just coming in and figuring it out. But it's very me coded. It's just hoodies, and we've got lots of hoodies. We've got baseball little shirts, haven't we? And we got the the hat, beanie, which I will now spend the next 6 months in a beanie, so that makes sense, and baseball cap. So yeah, it's like someone come and just raided my closet, to be honest. Yeah. So
and the quality of the stuff, it's really nice to be able to tell you that like it's good quality stuff. Like I don't, I'm happy to have it. It's comfortable. It fits well. It's good stuff. So yes.
Yeah. Awesome.
Tremendous excitement. All right. So we are going to kick off today's episode as we head toward wrestling topics with the Mr. McMahon documentary, which premiered on Netflix on Wednesday, September 25th, 2024. This documentary was produced by The Ringer, which is the Bill Simmons podcast network media company, and featured interviews with a lot of WWE personalities past and present, as well as a lot of work being done by Mr. Dave Meltzer, as well as I forgot his first name, Shoemaker.
David
Shoemaker. That's why I was like, it can't possibly be two Davids, and yet it was. Trish and I are going to talk through some of this documentary. We're going to talk through the media response to the documentary. Trish, your first thoughts on watching this? Where were you? Where was your head at?
So going in, I was, I don't think I was too positive about what it would be, because I think Dave Meltzer summed it up quite nicely, where he said the people that were kind of expecting a hit piece on Vince will see it as a hit piece on Vince, and the people that wanted, a real look into a lot of these allegations and scandals over the years will probably think they weren't hard enough for it.
Right.
And my confidence also came from my lack of confidence also came from the fact that if you listen to the Ringer episodes around the time the allegations came out this January, they were very uncomfortable with it. Yes. They were not confident with it. There wasn't a lot of coverage. They just wanted to kind of move to one side. So maybe I did go in with those kind of premeditated feelings. As a documentary itself, I thought it was slightly plodding. I wonder if it'd be different if you hadn't seen every WWE documentary in the last 20 years. Yeah. So maybe that's slightly a different aspect. There were just multiple moments where I just went, oh, fuck off. And it got more and more as it progressed. It wasn't just Cody. But yeah, there was a fair bit of that, because I think at this point we're so used to their kind of alternative facts and history, but there's times in this where you're just like, you absolutely cannot believe it. But yeah, that was my initial thoughts.
I thought, and I think it's worthwhile pointing out that The Ringer has a professional business relationship with WWE. They have a contract with them to produce content. And I think, as you said, the Ringer podcasts are not particularly interested in, they were uncomfortable with the topic of the Janelle Grant lawsuit, but they're also not particularly interested in covering non-WWE wrestling to any intense level or depth. And so this felt very much on brand for them. Like the way this documentary is set up, you would think that no other wrestling in the world exists. Like it's just WWE and no one has ever wrestled anywhere else. Like it's kind of shocking in that way to me. Like they just didn't touch on anything. But yeah, it was, I don't know. I have a lot of like weird thoughts about this. And for some of it, it's very hard not to sort of disintegrate into like a conspiracy theory mindset with the fact that Netflix is working on this with The Ringer and WWE together. I definitely, kind of agree with you that there were a bunch of moments where I was just like, what the fuck? Like, come on, do better than this. Come on. And I don't think it helped that like, obviously Dave Meltzer is very good at what he does, but I have not been particularly impressed with Shoemaker. So, those are my immediate thoughts.
That's fair. And I think it's important to mention the kind of context of this production, that it was not produced thinking it was going to be some, quote, dark side of the Vince style documentary. This was supposed to be something where he'd agreed to do it as like a project on his life, as how he saw it, a way for him to get his kind of mainstream recognition. And they thought they were going to investigate not only this character and they were going to cover some of, the scandals and things that have happened, but they thought they would be focusing on it. You can tell it by the way it kind of wraps up as, who is this guy? Where is the line between this character and this individual? And I think that's kind of what they went in with. And yet, these things happened during the course of it, and it became kind of very different. And, so I do have some sympathy in that aspect, that when the Wall Street Journal story broke in July 2022, they'd had 4 out of the 5 episodes they were going to commission done at the time. They were near enough done. So, it's a little bit different to think of it like that. So this wasn't a project that was looking at this going backwards or looking at this, in a 1-2 years time as a cumulative. This was something where they'd completed what they were doing and then had to kind of add on an addition.
I think it's definitely, there's some spots in the last episode where you can almost sort of see where you think they were going on this in terms of, he's a difficult and complicated person and no one can really get a handle on whether he's a good person or a bad person. And then it's like, oh no, he's actually a bad person. Like we can't even hedge that he might be a good person. It's just got to be flat out bad. And I thought that, I can, like you said, I can have sympathy for the fact that you have a creative process and you have a product that you think you've done a good job on, and then you're at the finish line and you're like, oh, fuck, I have to redo this completely, right? Like, shit. But, yeah.
I did think there were some positives, though. There were some things that I thought they did well, or things that they did well, but maybe with, like, kind of precursors. So, although I would say there was not nearly enough pushback directly in the interviews with Vince, there were times where they did push him and he struggled immensely. Yes. I look at it and think this is a guy who is constantly surrounded by yes men for his entire career. And has been
for years.
Yeah.
For years, yeah.
And all of a sudden, you've got somebody challenging him in a way that people just don't. And it was interesting to see how he reacted to it. And kind of like when we seen with Triple H in the press conference back at the Royal Rumble, they aren't used to it and they do not like it. And the answers that he gave when they pushed him on things like that were some of the most revealing. And, when we come to the Rita Chatterton answers, some of the most horrendous as well. But it was definitely a more revealing documentary in that way when it comes to Vince's own words than anything I can think of.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah. I also thought they used the archival footage and visual kind of use of footage was very, very effective. There was times when they didn't always kind of reinforce the themes with words, but they did a really good job of kind of visual montages. There was one bit where they kind of were glossing over the Attitude Era and Vince putting himself in these stories with women and where he's in a position of power, but they actually did it quite well in the visual imagery. So I don't think you needed someone to say it because the viewer can see it. And I also thought there was some spectacular editing that was incredibly funny.
Yes.
So there was one bit where Vince McMahon's doing, and Hulk Hogan are doing the 93,000 sold at the Pontiac Silverdome.
Yeah.
And Bruce Pritchard repeats it, and other people repeat it. And then it just goes into Dave Meltzer, and he's like, no, it was 78,000. Just deadpan. And it's completely laugh out loud. And then there's another one later on. And I liked it because they used it to kind of illustrate the most obvious lies.
Yes.
When we're talking about Hogan, Bischoff, Vince here, these guys are liars. And Vince is doing a quote about the Attitude Era, and he says, this may have been a standard deviation more than what we were doing before, but it was still family friendly. No one got killed, and they showed like a shot of the buried alive match.
Yes.
There was no rape, and you can see him calling somebody a rapist. No use of knives or guns, and so it's still family friendly. And they just kind of cut it in between perfectly. Yeah. And it just made that sense of, you can look through these words. And I was quite impressed. But some of the content that they got as well, some of the things they found that I don't think I've ever seen. I'm sure a lot of people that are really invested in this stuff haven't ever seen. So I thought they used that so well. They're getting the news archives, so they're researchers, forgetting whoever got the deals to get the footage. Fair play, because I thought that was excellent.
Yeah, the shot with Pillman with the gun was like...
Yeah.
Like, what else do you want from this? Like, yeah, I think that was extremely effective, but I think one of the challenges with that is that it just underlined in the sections where I wanted them to push back on stuff that was bullshit, or they left things out that I was like, you guys gonna mention this? That, it was very frustrating when that didn't happen. I think because they showed they could do that, and their researchers had done it, and instead there was some stuff that I was just like, you guys gonna mention this at all? Like, yeah. So that was... I agree with you, and also think it's, yeah.
What do you think about the fact... So, I follow a lot of British political kind of journalists, and there's been a lot of discussion around, especially after the two conventions in America recently, around questioning traditionally for these things, like talking heads, and even for like political interviews, is just kind of... There isn't as much pushback and challenge in the US as a tradition.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because of access or kind of that sort of thing. Do you think that's correct and that plays a part here?
What do you mean, that they were unwilling to push back on certain people?
That they were unwilling to push back on certain people, but also like that's just a more standard American thing than what we experience with kind of those interviews in the kind of UK, or is it because they've got someone who never agrees to do anything with them and access to them that they're very careful how much they push?
I don't know. That's a tough question in terms of like trying to figure out motive. I do think there's a degree for the US in general where, as rude as we can be, there's this sort of element of confronting someone with a lie that they've told directly is a bit much, right? Like, I think, the pushing back that they did in this documentary with him is probably as far as they were willing to take it. But, I don't know. It's definitely something that is odd nowadays, that people are less willing to sort of push back on direct falsehoods. But I'm not sure like how you fix that. I do think some of it is access related. I think we see this with, press conferences for wrestling in general. We've seen this with the media scrums with WWE. They're not happy being asked these questions. Like, they make it very clear that they're not happy being asked these questions, and even from that video you saw Vince with the clip where he was beating the crap out of the interviewer, Armin Katanian. Like, he's attempting to, if he can't bully you with his words, he's going to bully you with physical violence. And it's hard to imagine that somebody like that, that's gone completely from his repertoire. The whole thing that they talked about with regards to being there at 2:00 in the morning, right? That's him attempting to exert control over the process.
Absolutely.
And keep people on edge, right? So if I'm willing to do this, like I could leave at any time and this is over and the millions of dollars you've invested in it is done. Right?
That's a really good point. Yeah.
So,
yeah, they showed some of his kind of more narcissistic tendencies. Yeah. When he's talking about the Mr. McMahon character, and he's like, I invented it basically from arrogant people throwing their weight around and bullying and things that I disliked. And then it's contradicted by every single person practically that's ever worked for him, except for John Cena, who repeats the kind of exactly the same thing around his own rap persona, and said that he took things that he saw and disliked into that character the same way Vince did. That was kind of an interesting thing, because everybody else You know, whether it was Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart or Bruce Pritchard or Steve Austin or even Shane, we're just like, nah, same guy.
Well, I think this is where you can kind of touch back to the part where, like, you can see the seams on the original documentary. Is that kind of like, we've talked about that when we talked about, like, you know, difficult geniuses, right? We have to put up with this because this is the only way that we can get good art. Right? The only way wrestling is possible is by dealing with this difficult Vince McMahon character, because this is, you know, we couldn't have gotten this without that. And I think this is part of what we talk about a lot in terms of the industry changing and moving on. Like, you don't have to have a shitty working environment. Like, think back to what, you know, the whole discussion about Stephanie as a good boss versus Shane as a good boss, right? Shane's too nice, right? That's just a fucking, like that's a self-propelling prophecy right there. Like, I can't respect someone who treats me well, you know? And I think that kind of ties into that sort of like this vicious genius idea of like, this individual, you know, should treat me bad. It's okay if they treat me badly because look at what they're capable of producing from an artistic point of view.
And it was interesting because they made the other thing that I think they did a good job on was they made it clear that he was successful in the wrestling business.
Right.
But every time that he stepped out and went, you know, because as Tony Atlas said, he thought he was in the entertainment business.
Right.
He just wanted to use wrestling as a stepping stone to other stuff, and then it just failed.
Right.
And it showed that he had this clear misunderstanding of kind of the rest of the world. As much as he goes on about, you know, we know America, we know... It was clear that he knew wrestling, but he doesn't know anything else. And I did like how they kind of pointed it out. What did you think of how it showed the kind of differences between the relationships that he has with his family and the relationships with the talent that tend to be kind of, you know, he's been like a father figure to me?
I think a lot of this is this... I do think that was a good theme, and I think you touched on this, that it was something that Garrett Gonzalez was really good at picking out when he did his coverage of this with Dave Meltzer. Mm-hmm. You know, it is interesting that you have essentially Shane and Stephanie both in, not necessarily in interview moments, but in more uncaptured moments where they're both essentially saying he was a shitty father. Like, he's a shitty father. Like that bit with Heyman, when Heyman is like talking to Stephanie behind the scenes somewhere and being like, you know, he pushes you. And she's like, yeah, it sucks. Like, you know, I think that plus these guys being like, you know, oh, he's like a father to me. I'd take a bullet for him. All that bullshit. It was fucking fascinating because I do think some of this boils down to like this perception that I think you see this not just in wrestling, but in other places. Like and we talked about this a little bit with Bryan Danielson and his reaction when the story first broke, and how Bryan Danielson was like, you know, Vince is a good, you know what I mean? Like he had positive things to say about Vince. He went back on those. He said different things afterwards, and I'm not trying to ignore that. But I think there's an element of, you know, in order to succeed at a high level in anything, wrestling or whatever, you have to have a tremendous sense of ego, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a degree to which a lot of these wrestlers and a lot of these guys, men especially, are like, you know, Vince has to be special, because if Vince is not special, then maybe I'm not special, and it's just this fucking weirdo guy who liked me because I have a good physique, right? Like, what am I have to be better than other people. There has to be something within him that sees something. And I also think he's a fucking weirdo who just fucked with their brands a lot, right? Like, and you can even see that, like, one of the things that I got struck by was, and you know that this happens, but watching that behind the scenes clip where he's literally telling the announcers what to say, like he's doing the announcers and expecting them to like repeat it. It's like, Jesus Christ, the level of like mind fuckery of like, I can't even speak, you know, without being told that I'm not doing it correctly. I don't know. I think there's something really deep in there, and kind of, I veer wildly back and forth between thinking that someone like John Cena is an asshole for not being more outspoken against Vince McMahon, and then having sympathy for John Cena because I almost feel like he's a victim of Stockholm syndrome, right? Like, yeah. You know, I don't know that I can. It depends on the time of day. That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that. You know, these men and women judge their success off the opinion of one man.
Right.
So they are going to look at him differently. They are going to place him on a pedestal when they are successful off that.
Right.
And we're still seeing it. You see that all the time. You know, you haven't made anything to you in WWE, that sort of thing. So there is still that element.
Well, that was the part about the documentary that kind of frustrated me in the fact that it didn't place WWE in a wider context of professional wrestling. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was the fact that they started talking about WWE as being successful before it actually was, right? Like, they recapped the 2010s and they were talking about how successful WWE was. And like, this whole thing was shot in like summer of 22, right? Early summer of 22, which was just the very beginning of when WWE was starting their like return to being super popular. Up until that point, like, and it was that WrestleMania, I think, where they started to get things back on track. But up until that point, they were losing audiences. They were not being as successful. Like, they had, like, shit for them had dropped. People were not going. Like, even when they talked about the creation of AEW, they didn't talk about it in terms of, it came out of like, well, WWE was so successful that AEW started. And it's like, no, AEW started because WWE sucked. And it sucked for a long fucking time. And it drove off a lot of fans because it wasn't giving fans what they wanted out of professional wrestling. There's a whole other world of professional wrestling that existed in like 2000s, 2010s, specifically because WWE sucked, and they didn't touch on that at all. And I thought that was a major negative to me for the documentary.
That's fair. I also thought, with Shane and Stephanie, I thought it was very interesting. They were the only ex-WWE people who weren't identified with WWE in any job role. And it's even funnier because Stephanie's actually been, she's been interviewed in her old office. You can see everything down the side, and it's like, it's a strange contradiction. But, we're going to disagree with this. So I thought that what they did in episode 6 with the journalists, by having Dave Meltzer explain things, by having Joe Palazzo and Ted Mann explain things, was some of the stronger parts of it. And because there were still elements missing and things that was frustrating. Yeah. But compared to how they told some other stories, say like the Owen Hart story where we completely gloss over negligence, and I thought it was one of the stronger parts of the series.
I think that's fair. I think
no, you don't.
I love you. I respect your opinions. I don't even want to shit on you when you're wrong.
Go
on. I just felt that the total lack of involvement, like John Laurinaitis' name was not mentioned. Mm-hmm. The fact that WWE was a part of this lawsuit was not mentioned. The stuff about Stephanie and the Ashley Mazzaro stuff was not mentioned. Like, I appreciate that they put effort into making this, stating it, having the third parties go into it, not do just having WWE people talk about it, which clearly they couldn't because they couldn't get any of those people on film, other than Pritchard. Even Pritchard, I don't think he got on film. But like, I just feel like there was a bunch of this that when people like Dave say, well, people want it to have been harder, right? Like, they did such a good job in some of the sections, like you said, with the Attitude Era and using the footage and everything else. And they just dropped a lot of that. And that was the part that I was kind of like, this is, you are soft pedaling something that's really horrible and making it look like you're not soft pedaling it.
Okay. It's interesting we have such a different viewpoint on that. I do think there was plenty that they missed out. I don't think that they went, especially when it came to the run of allegations, they kind of glossed through the payments to other people in the NDAs and that sort of thing. But I thought compared to the way it explored other issues and other things in the documentary, I thought it was stronger. What I did find interesting was Ted Mann talking about how they got the tip.
This is a thing that, again, doesn't get enough discussion ever, right? Let alone in this documentary, Trish.
So, he said it started with a tip, and the tip was someone on the board. WWE had received an anonymous email alleging that Vince McMahon had kept quite an affair with an employee of the company and covered it up. The person who wrote the email portrayed it as a relationship where McMahon was taking advantage of someone. And then they showed like the Vince thing on SmackDown, and they showed the Stephanie thing, which I was glad they showed actually. I thought, people need to see how ridiculous this looks. Yeah. How insane this is. And then, they went through the follow-up, and then they showed him returning to the company and Stephanie leaving. And I thought they had good comments from the people at the Wall Street Journal and also from Dave Meltzer. I thought that was one of Dave Meltzer's strongest bits. But what was kind of interesting about that is no one has really ever asked a question. That information must have come from the board.
Right.
It comes from the WWE board. directly. If it doesn't come from there, does any of this ever happen?
Right.
Who knows? There might still be a lawsuit, but I don't know. But it's very interesting that there's never a focus on that, on where did that come from? Who gave that to the Wall Street Journal?
To me, watching it, it felt very much like they wanted to tie Stephanie to that. Like, not accuse her of having done it, but they really wanted to make it clear that Stephanie was not, happy with this and blah, 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 and all this other stuff. And I'm like, the way they did the timeline, and again, I know I only watched this once, so I may be not remembering it correctly. But
you don't need to watch it twice. Don't do it to yourself.
But it did feel a bit like they were trying to soft pedal, even like they showed the video of her with the SmackDown thing and they had Dave discussing it, but it also seemed like they wanted to soft pedal it, like, the second he was coming back, she was out of there, right? When the reality is like, I don't know, I just felt like that was one of those things where they were trying very hard to portray Stephanie as like,
well, she was out of there.
She was.
She literally went very, very quickly. That doesn't take away from going out on SmackDown and doing the thank you Vince stuff, which looks completely ridiculous.
Right.
But in terms
I just feel like
of
the timeline is a little funkier than the documentary made it out to be.
Probably. Yeah, and there are some elements of that because you're trying to do this kind of simplifying it for the biggest audience that you can.
Right.
I'm not trying to Yeah. I'm not trying. It's not like letting them off, but I can see how that happens, I think. But yeah, there were some negative points or things that were kind of really frustrating, and we discussed them already. But the biggest thing was that the WWE mythology and the Vince mythology really were allowed to control the narrative in large parts.
Yeah.
There were so many lies that went unchecked, whether it was Cody claiming Andre the Giant was wrestling's first special attraction, or not covering events properly in the Montreal screw job where Brett didn't refuse to lose, or the Wendy Richter screw job where they're literally interviewing her and she's not, and there's nothing about it on there, and it's like, no, she didn't refuse to lose like Vince McMahon says. She didn't sign a contract. And it's like, you have the person there, like, why is there not a quote? So that was kind of frustrating. And then you had normal lies that we hear, like, all the time, Stone Cold Austin 316 happened one night, or he was the first ever tweener, or McMahon was the most hated heel ever in wrestling, which is just ridiculous. And it almost felt like, so in, like, history we talk about having, like, an orthodox history, and then revisionist history, and then post-revisionist. And the kind of fact check and the kind of post-revisionist, the person that looks back, felt like that was, like, Dave Meltzer's role.
Yes.
And then you had this full alternative history, this revisionist history. And then we didn't really have a voice for kind of the orthodox. And that kind of kept being prevalent. And even sometimes when we had the people involved, we still didn't feel like we had that voice. And it was an interesting choice for people because 90% of the people that were wrestlers or people that had worked for Vince McMahon that were not family were at a high level.
Right. Yes. I feel like this is the important part that, like, part of, you're getting a skewed viewpoint from people who are talking about McMahon because these are the people who were successful. And I don't know how beyond the victims, which I think you can understand why some of the victims wouldn't have wanted to have been a part of this documentary. Like, I would have really had thoughts about it. But beyond that, like, there's no one in the documentary who's like, I was a really great wrestler, but I was unsuccessful because Vince McMahon thought I was too short. Right? Like, I had no place to work. I had no opportunity to work because of some weird arbitrary thing he did. Instead, it's just these constant testimonials from people who have fame directly because of Vince McMahon. No one's there whose life was ruined by him. Right? And I think that's something that, like, it missed that human element from that perspective. That's my perspective. That's my thought anyway.
No, I agree. And, I think that it underplayed, therefore, on the surface, the amount of control that Vince had on these people. So you're hearing lots of discussions where Hogan and The Rock and Cena are talking about, how they get opportunities, and it feels like it's like a closed discussion. It's interesting, actually. It's Triple H that's kind of the one that says, well, if I didn't want to do something, and go, he'd just get me to do it anyway. But everybody else, it sounds more like a collaboration. Than it actually is. And I also thought it was very interesting who wasn't involved. So out of all the top guys that has been in the last 3 decades, I think Roman Reigns is the only one that really wasn't included.
Yep.
We had Cody Rhodes representing the kind of modern era, but not Roman. And then we didn't have, people that you tend to associate with Vince McMahon. There was no Jim Ross, no Kevin Dunn, no Jerry McDevitt. And then there was I thought, a contained effort to not focus on the new leadership involved with WWE.
Yes.
Other than Dwayne Johnson. So there was no Ari Emanuel and there was no Nick Khan. And they were talking about the succession plan, and when Vince left, it's going to be Stephanie and Triple H. And there's no mention of Nick Khan, who's really doing the key roles there.
Yes.
And so I thought that was very, very interesting. There was also no women who worked for Vince McMahon outside, not family, obviously, but outside of Wendy Richter and Trish Stratus.
Right.
Who, you could tell, there's things, they were trying to be careful, but they also had things to say that, were kind of flashing red lights. And that was the only two people that had worked for Vince McMahon that were not his family that spoke on this documentary. And if you look at the WWE kind of wrestlers, writers, personalities, it was a 6-to-1 male to female ratio. Just that pretty much says quite a lot about wrestling for me.
I mean, it's not really a surprise. It's just fucking, I don't blame women who, for their own sanity or whatever, are just like, I can't do it. I get it. Sometimes you just have to be like, I can't do it. But you'd hope they would. One hopes that they asked women and the women said no, rather than that they just didn't think it was that particularly important. But
and that's the difficulty, is we don't know exactly.
Correct.
Other than we know that Janelle Grant was asked and didn't do it. And to be honest, when you watch it, you think, yeah, absolutely, don't do. There's no way that you should have been involved in this. But we don't know who was asked, who wasn't. We don't know who was controlling that. Right. It's you can see that it's a lot of WWE personalities in this. So you don't know who's controlling what aspect of that. But I think it's there was other things not covered as well. I think Eddie Guerrero was passed over very quickly. Brian Pillman wasn't covered. Plane Ride from Hell. I'm sure you can think of many others. But the biggest thing for me, and the thing that I struggled with most, was I found that the victims in a lot of these situations were often kind of nameless and voiceless.
Yeah.
So there was footage used from old reports, like for Tom Cole and Rita Chatterton, but there's no interviews with family, friends, or the victim in any of these cases in general.
Yeah.
And it's not made clear if they requested. And then even with the death of Nancy Argentino in a Jimmy Snuka story, she's not even named. Right. It's just there was a death in a hotel room and they weren't able to prove it to those charges, and then discussing whether Vince played a part in the charges or not. So we weren't even naming the victims, and I found that hard to kind of get the grips with.
But that's the part that makes you question what kind of documentary this was going to be before the Janelle Grant stuff, right? Mm-hmm. How much of this was going to be, I don't want to say a whitewashing of Vince McMahon, because I don't think it was ever intended to be a whitewashing of Vince McMahon, but I think how much of it was it's not going to be totally bad, right? He has some good stuff to him. And I think if you keep your victims nameless and you keep them off screen, it makes that a lot easier. You don't have somebody sitting there saying to you, this is what happened to me.
Yeah, and when you have things like the Mel Phillips part in the Ring Boy scandal, and you have Phil Mushnick and you have Dave Meltzer, who were both directly told by Vince McMahon that Phillips had previously been fired on suspicion of being a pedophile, we say in the UK, and then was brought back. And they show the article where Mushnick makes that public on the screen, and then they don't cover it, don't use it, and they don't ask or show, if they have asked Dave or Phil Mushnick about it.
Right.
Just you have these people there. This is not something where you have to go and find them. You have these people there, and we're still not getting those key bits of information in some of these scenarios. It just felt like they really needed a fact checker. They needed someone to send it to and go, add in the parts we're missing that makes this important, but maybe they didn't want the parts that were missing. It's hard to kind of work out how that works. But
one of the funny things to me in discussing that is one of the things, and I know you're going to touch on this later, I'm jumping ahead, but the part where Dave Meltzer, when he did the recap stuff and when he talked to Garrett Gonzalez about this, one of the things he essentially did was blame the mainstream media for a lack of coverage of Vince McMahon's crimes, which allowed Vince to continue operating pretty much as he had done because nobody was really getting into this stuff. And then you have kind of the documentary at the end sort of being like, well, it's Dave's sort of thesis that it's the audience's fault. It's our fault for continuing to watch and not stopping this from happening by just not producing it. But it almost made me think, is it the audience's fault or is it again, we're in a situation where we have a mainstream media documentary that's skipping over some of this stuff, right? Or like not fact checking, as you said, some of these things that could have been pushed harder as, problems.
I think it's hard to kind of look at what it is, but it's interesting because I'll kind of jump a bit and we'll come back, but there is a very much attitude towards the kind of media and the fan base illustrated throughout this. And, when it comes to the fan base, in terms of the documentary makers, there's one bit that was being pointed out by our friend Chris Gannon, and Todd Martin pointed out on The Torch on Friday, where they're showing Stephanie McMahon after the drive-through Reading with Triple H on Raw. And they edit it so when she comes out the next night, the whole crowd is chanting slut, 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 slut. But it wasn't that reaction. They used footage from like 3-4 months later when she's a heel.
Yes.
And they've inserted it in there to make that reaction up there. So this is our fan base. This is how they reacted to this. They thought this was acceptable. And, from a documentary maker, that wasn't great. I didn't think I get the story you were trying to tell in that aspect, but it kind of made that fan base look kind of that stereotypical thing. And there was other things as well. So they talked about the stereotypical use of foreign heels and exploiting real world events. And Bruce Pritchard said something that just made me, I don't know, let me read it and then you can tell me your reaction to it, okay? It says, "You can't find an Iranian sheik walking down the street that you can boo and hiss at or see him get beat up, but you could do it you could go to the wrestling matches and see it."
I mean, it's like that. It did make me. A lot of this made me feel like you said that there was a desire to portray wrestling audiences in a specific type of light, and not necessarily a positive one. And I certainly think that's. Listen, we've criticized wrestling audiences a lot on this podcast, but I felt like that to some degree is kind of unfair, especially as we talked about. There's so much of the wrestling media ecosystem that is just completely and totally devoted to protecting WWE against any consequences of any behavior, of any choices that anybody in the organization makes, right? And even the best wrestling media are guilty of that. We see that happen time and time again. So it's like, how are you going to be mad at an audience that doesn't know something is happening? And but beyond that, like, it's just, you're taking the least common denominator and being like, this is who we are.
It plays in a perception, a stereotype where you're like appealing to base instincts.
Right.
And there's a bit of Triple H is quoting around things they did in the Attitude Era, and he's like, who's worse, the guy that did it or the people that loved it? And I just... Right. And then Bret Hart's talking about, the fans have become wild dogs that want more and more and more all the time. Or do the fans want more, or does Vince want more?
Right.
Are you using him as using them as that surrogate to someone to blame? Because you can't frame that guy because that guy gives you your entire value in your career.
Right.
And, there was another bit as well where Vince McMahon is talking and he says, "What I say is totally different from what I think. The public doesn't understand that sometimes. As a businessman, you have to say a lot of things that might not be how you feel, but it controls thought process by doing that." And it's just complete manipulation. It's a certain level of content. And I think he was talking about how they kind of made themselves the underdog when it came to WCW and how they portrayed themselves. But it's like it displays a content to the audience. And absolutely, I think Dave talked about the SmackDown ratings after Vince retired, quote unquote, the first time. And there is an element of, there are people that don't care. But yes. I think it's so dismissive of the entire audience. And it also plays into that thing of wanting to escape the world of wrestling, of wanting it to be more than wrestling that he talks about. So, that was definitely a thing that went through the documentary. That you could kind of feel. And it's funny because we talked about the media and how the media encourages that, but they also have this attitude towards the media as well.
Yes. Yes.
And they will use both parts to kind of play off against each other. And I think the thing with the media is that always kind of frustrated him, and Pritchard touched on it, was something that he couldn't control.
Correct.
And they benefited largely from if mainstream media left them alone.
Yes.
Yeah, and when it came to wrestling media, they thought it could see it off sometimes by replicating it. So, they had shows like Bite This in the early 2000s. In the mid 2010s, they were running results on their website, pretending they were like a wrestling news website. And, during the Linda McMahon Senate campaign, they were trying to use their audience to drive pressure on the media. They had the Stand Up for WWE campaign, which, went after articles on their website to exert pressure on these reporters. And then you've obviously everyone's seen the meme that says like "Stand Up for WWE," right, with the guy with a t-shirt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But do you actually know? Have you ever seen the actual 10 things that they actually ask people to do?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So which one of these would you do? I'm going to read them out. Which one of these would you do to stand up for WWE as a proud member of the WWE universe? Okay. Would you forward stand up to WWE videos to your friends? Yes, they did make them. Upload testimonials to Facebook and YouTube voicing your support. Email your friends and family stating why you are a WWE fan. I think my dad would disown me. She'd be like, what are you doing? Just send me my cricket tickets. Friend WWE on Facebook. Make an I am standing up for WWE your Facebook status. God, this is so bad. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. Share your favourite WWE stories on Twitter and Facebook. Email the reporter if you've read a story which is unfair to WWE. And finally,
Christ.
Yeah. And finally, create signs and shirts of I stand up for WWE for WWE live events.
What's funny is how much of this, like, and again, I've seen this, how much of it is, like, fucking weirdo behavior interspersed with legitimate fandom stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you're a legitimate fan of something, you talk about it to the people in your life because you're like, hey, I saw this, it was cool, you might like it, right? If you go to a wrestling show, you wear t-shirts and you freaking make signs, like normal wrestling fan behavior, like you like videos of your favorite wrestlers doing shit on fucking media. Like some of these things are extremely normal things to do, interspersed with like contact your newspaper about unfavorable coverage, which is where you start getting into like weirdo North Korea behavior, right? Like
it's proper like, 1984, isn't it?
It's fucking weirdo shit, like but like this is their mindset of like what they think is acceptable from fans, or was their mindset. But let's be realistic. I don't think it's changed significantly.
Oh, there's still that manipulation element. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah. It's using the same thing where they talk about the mixing of reality and fiction and blurring the lines in terms of wrestling. It's using that kind of thought process and that kind of psychology in a different way.
Yes.
And they think because wrestling fans are used to that, it's probably easier to do them. And look, it probably is. We see it all the time.
Yes.
We see it all the time, but it's that thing of control, and then and you can feel that in other parts of the documentary as well, because there is very much that culture of fear and punishment. And what I thought was really interesting about this is all the kind of ways that that's illustrated underneath the surface were filmed before the kind of allegations came out.
Yep. So
you've got Bret Hart being very clear around the Ring Boy scandal and just saying Mel Phillips was a total paedophile who preyed on these young boys who were complying with requests for sexual favours. And then they talk about, the hierarchy of WWE and the power structure in terms of this scandal by also then talking about Pat Patterson. And then you get this exchange with Tony Atlas, which I know will preface this by saying that Dave Meltzer has cast doubt on this.
Yeah.
But he says, and this is the difference between how we view kind of regular hierarchy and how it is involved in wrestling using kind of fear. And so Tony Atlas says, we all know Pat was doing this stuff. I didn't like Pat because he kept grabbing my pecker in the locker room. And the interviewer goes, kind of incredulous, is like, he what? And Atlas said, he would grab my pecker. And the interviewer says, did you guys complain? And he's like, to who? He's the booker. He's the number 2 guy in the office. To who? And the interviewer goes, Vince. And Atlas just like bursts out laughing. And I'm sure if you've heard Tony Atlas, you know what his laugh sounds like. And he's like, you know nothing about the wrestling business. You either take it or you go home. Who are you going to complain to? Like, for what? You want to get fired? He needed Pat more than he needed me. I wouldn't say he protected him. He protected the business.
Right.
And it just completely shows that structure.
It shows that structure, and I think I mean, a man asked this question, right? Like, I don't know, like, it's clear that the male interviewer is the one who was doing this stuff, but because, like, let's be honest, I think we've all had work situations where, like, something is like, oh, I didn't really care for this, but I'm not really going to get any feedback on this if I go talk to somebody about it, or if I share that I'm concerned with this. I mean, again, things are very different now than they were at other times in history from an HR perspective, but it's still not like, this is the kind of thing that, maybe it's an extreme, but to a lesser degree, you see this in corporations all the time. And like, but this is what underlines the stuff that Vince did. Like, Vince had this culture of, like you said, fear and control in this environment where, he could literally do anything that he wanted to do. No one was going to stop him.
Yeah, and even, so the two female performers that were on the documentary that weren't family, in Wendy Richter and Trish Stratus. Wendy Richter talks about, I was humiliated. And they infer it's like because she didn't want to lose the belt, but actually because she didn't sign a contract.
Right.
So the two female voices that they have, one of them is saying she was humiliated as a punishment. And then Trish Stratus talks about not wanting to kiss another female performer, not thinking it was right for her character. So she lost the belt at WrestleMania the following week. And, she infers that she thought she was being punished. And she says, maybe you can read between the lines. And even like Dave Meltzer agrees with that. So your two female voices on this whole documentary from, who worked for Vince McMahon are listing out how they were punished in these scenarios. And, and Jimmy Hart he shows the fear because, he's like, I'm really cautious when doing this. I don't know what they want in the open or not. So it's just that huge element of control that's kind of this undercurrent that sits through it. It's a real theme here. And, what plays into that as well, where that seems to be most prevalent is around the kind of attitudes towards women.
Oh, yeah.
And
oh, yeah. One of the moments where I stood up and was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" was I'm pretty sure it was Heyman being like, "Well, women were not really seen. Women were not. There wasn't really the talent level that was needed in the Attitude Era." And I'm like, again, we have created a world where only WWE exists. No women's wrestlers existed, and the part where you're going to fucking porn stars and fucking models and being like, hey, you want to be a wrestler, as opposed to talking to women who actually want to wrestle, like, that's just hand waved away, right? It was the women's revolution. Women were finally ready to be part of wrestling. Like, fuck you, dude. Like, that part just infuriated me. And it was another thing that, again, just got completely, yes, of course, nobody pushed back on it. There was no counter to it. Correct. The women's revolution was the first time that professional wrestling really had a women's presence in it. Like, no other, like, that fucking pissed me the fuck off. Like, fuck you guys. Sorry. That just... Fuck you guys. It
was really hilarious, actually, because you had the standard, Stephanie McMahon came from our fans, and basically everyone else going, she's the brainchild behind it.
Right,
and there's like no mention of Ronda Rousey, who's the actual key component to changing Vince's perception because of the ratings that she brought in when she came in and her performance in UFC, where she was a groundbreaker in UFC, not in WWE, never as cut. But also it's like, at the same time, on Netflix at the moment, you've got the Dump Matsumoto documentary about all Japan women.
Yeah.
And it's like where you can see that this thing was huge in Japan, you can see, and this era, and people are looking into that. And you've got this contradiction with them going, well, people had to make a hashtag because we wouldn't give our women any time and actually have them wrestle. And it's just, duh. And then it's like there's a kind of an attempt to kind of have normalcy around this. So there's all this justifications around, especially around stuff that happened in the Attitude Era. And I can kind of see why some of the performers would do that, a Triple H, a Rock, and us, because this was the time period where they were most successful.
Yes.
So you don't want to talk down like your own achievements by talking down that period, but you've got like Shawn Michaels saying, there are times we could have been less objectionable towards women, or Vince McMahon saying you just can't apply the same things. Life was different then, values were different then. You can't take the values of the day and put them back on.
It was 1998, okay? Like, I get that it was a little bit different, but we're not talking about like the fucking 1950s. Like, Jesus Christ, dudes.
And they tried to tie it into the rest of society. They talked about Jerry Springer. They talked about Howard Stern. And, there's one bit where they catch Stephanie out a little bit as well.
Yeah.
With the quote on Mike Tyson where she says, technically he hadn't been arrested for rape when he did that, when he'd actually been arrested and convicted and jailed. And they said she had, and she's like, he had, and it just goes to complete silence and a cut. It's just, but there's almost an element, and this probably plays into, for anyone that knows anything inside of wrestling, knows that this sort of respect thing, and we talked about a lot of this with the CM Punk stuff, where things that might seem abnormal to us are normal in wrestling, but when you listen to them talk around the curtain call and then talk around the treatment of women during this period, they are far more upset around the curtain call than they are about what happened to women during the Attitude Era and what's happened to women in WWE in general. You've got like Bret Hart, who we've had, the good side of Bret Hart we talked about previously. Was that the bad side? We had every side of Bret Hart other than Goldberg, to be honest. Which is standard Bret Hart.
I enjoy that.
Yeah, but he's like, they killed wrestling that day with a curtain call. They didn't kill wrestling with steroids. They didn't kill wrestling with deaths. They didn't kill wrestling with, the treatment of women or pedophiling or anything like that. No. The curtain call killed wrestling. And
again, you could make this like a 9-part documentary if you included the history of other promotions, but the lack of like discussing the fact that this shit did exist elsewhere really, really damages a lot of the conversation in this, right? Like, it's so easy to like go past it and that's where you question like some of these guys, like, if Bill Simmons is the executive producer, like, does Bill Simmons know enough about the history of non-WWE wrestling to really be able to discuss it? Like, was anybody in the fucking production series, like anybody going, hey, this isn't actually what's happening? And I understand, I am not a Bill Simmons fan. I have not been a Bill Simmons fan for
never,
probably 25 fucking years at this point, and I fucking wrote that man a letter once, but non-negotiable.
Was it because you were standing up for WWE?
No. This was many, many years ago. But it's, regardless, he's also not somebody with a tremendous track record of, like, being understanding or sympathetic to women's issues when it comes to sports, right? Like, he's someone, whatever. I'm not going to get into it. I think this is where you see the lack of intellectual curiosity of wrestling in general, versus like, we're going to tell the real story of WWE. You can't do that unless you talk about non-WWE wrestling. Like, it's just not possible.
And, this is a culture thing. So I don't think it did a great job of exploring these things as a culture.
No.
And it wasn't a culture that was just WWE. It's a culture that has invaded wrestling for decades. And there was one in particular thing they talked about where, and I discussed it afterwards in the house, and they said it was Trish Stratus was talking around the dog barking thing that she did, where Vince McMahon had her in the ring and had her bark like a dog. And it was obviously I think it sounded like a very reversed, like a kind of rehearsed answer.
Yeah.
And she said, they want me to be like, when people ask her about it, they want me to be like, that was horrible. But that's exactly what we want you to feel, don't you get it? We knew how it was going to be interpreted and misinterpreted. We are aware of that. And then, when she eventually gets her kind of revenge at WrestleMania by slapping him or whatever, she was like, that was my WrestleMania moment that year, to be able to stand up to Vince McMahon. And I just watched it and like, you have to think that when these interviews were done and the pressures that are on these people and the fact that she did actually give up, elements that she'd been controlled in other ways, which was then, useful in a way, well, not useful, but it was, you could see the corresponding then when they talked about Ashley Massaro. So there was something else to compare it to. Right. But it was just so deflating to hear someone talk about something like that when they've been put in that situation like that. And maybe she believes it, maybe she believes that. But
that's one of the struggles, and that's where, like, I talk about this a little bit, and I talked about this in the interview we did with Brian Alvarez, where, like, one of the problems with aging, right, in a, especially as a non-white dude in American culture, Western culture, is that, like, you come to a point where you realize that the younger generation is not happy with the way that you lived your life or fought against injustice or did what you had to do just to get to where you needed to be, right? And so, like, on the one hand, I don't think that anybody should not criticize Trish Stratus for saying these things or saying, geez, it's disappointing that she said this stuff, but you'd like to hope that we could have some empathy to understand why she's in a position that she feels like she has to do this, or that this is what she wants to say, or why she's in a position where this is what is she's comfortable with discussing, or this is how she feels, right? I have empathy for that. I couldn't imagine could you imagine working in that kind of environment on a daily basis? How much that would have fucked with your head, right? Like, and we've said this about the guys. Can you imagine how much worse it was for the non-white, non-straight, non-male wrestlers who weren't successful, who weren't, Vince's chosen ones? Like, that's got to be some serious psychological damage. And I don't blame people for telling themselves lies to get past what they have to get past to make peace with themselves and what they had to do. I have empathy for that. I'd like to think that I have empathy for everybody involved, with the exception of fucking Vince McMahon and Bruce Pritchard. Piece of shit.
But it was interesting because they kind of said it was like a thing of its time and is acceptable. And it was clearly not acceptable at that time. Dave Meltzer kind of goes through that as well. And then you have Sharon Mazar, I don't want to get pronunciation wrong, who was the author of Professional Wrestling, Sport and Spectacle, who was actually incidentally the only female journalist on this entire show. So if you want to talk about ratio of like where, there's an underrepresentation, you can see that there. But she said, what they did was reinforce those tendencies rather than challenging or transforming them into something else. And it gave them kind of plausible deniability because it's just wrestling. It's just a performance. Everything can kind of be put under that kind of bracket. And that was kind of an interesting way to look at it. But probably the worst thing when it comes to, treating a woman where Vince actually talks about what happened was the Rita Chatterton case. And, I was always struck at the end of each episode you had kind of each settlement and each NDA. But this one was slightly different because this was the question that kind of really exposed him. Because he said one of those things was alleged rape that never happened. But once you're accused of rape, you are a rapist. It was consensual, but actually, had it been a rape, the statute of limitations had run out. What? And then at the end of the episode, it shows that there was a temporary lift of the statute of limitations for alleged victims of sexual offences in New York State in 2023, and McMahon paid a multi-million-dollar settlement to Chatterton. McMahon continues to deny any wrongdoing. And the callousness of how you discuss something that's happened to a human being in that aspect was just, it's like one of them things where you just stop and you go, what? Because maybe we live to different standards in that aspect, but...
I mean, that's one of the things, that's why it was so immediately plausible when Janelle Grant filed this lawsuit, right? Because what is it about Vince McMahon that makes you think that he gives a flying fuck about what his sexual partners want?
I don't think he gives a fuck about anybody.
No, and agreed. I don't think he gives a flying fuck what anybody in his life wants, right? Yeah. And so it's much easier to believe that he doesn't give a flying fuck about what these women want. It's irrelevant to him, right? And, so it becomes immediately more believable because you just have to look at the guy.
Yeah, and he lives by this kind of contradiction where you can't challenge him or you can't kind of do anything to him, and he feels he has that persecution complex. Right. But he can do anything to anybody else. And, they point it out in a business sense because they talk about what he did to the territories and then what WCW did to him and how it's the same thing, and yet he cannot see it. And you can see, that attitude is not gone with Vince McMahon. We can still see how that works with AEW now. Yes. It's no different. That mentality is still completely there. And, he's... I like how he kind of gets questioned on it. And Paul Heyman comes up with a quote which is, accurate, and we see as well. He says, Vince always saw everyone else as just a feeder system to the major leagues of WWE. Yep. And you can see how he kind of vocalizes that and how that affects him. And, Bischoff talks very well about how he wants to be like his rival is Ted Turner, not Eric Bischoff. and it shows you how he wants to kind of live. But that kind of ideology really has kind of lived on. And, you know, the other thing that I thought was really interesting in context of this year was they did show the Mickie James story after the tanning salon story came out.
Yes.
The false accusation skit that they ran. Because in his mind, he's always the victim. You know, he's always that person, so he has to display that in some way. You know, and he actually denies that this is kind of happening on screen. And they've got the same one with the Sable clip where he says, you know, all I knew is that she come back from work. And they showed a clip of Stephanie McMahon saying, you know, she sued the company for millions of dollars for sexual harassment. Didn't get a comment from Stephanie, which annoyed me a little bit on that one. You know, if you're going to use the footage of her, then there should be a comment to kind of show that way. But, you know, he's denying that they're doing that. And yet we've seen them do that this year with the Dominic Mysterio and Liv Morgan stuff.
Right.
And maybe it's a bit more messy because they use it, you know, you can disrupt that news cycle, but there's also that thing of normalization as well as there is that kind of, you know, wanting to put your own kind of narrative out there and then make that the accepted narrative. Yes. But all of these things play in. It's these patterns of behaviour because of this kind of persecution thing where you can do everything you want, but nobody can come for you.
Yeah.
There was another thing that I found kind of funny as well. It's not really funny, but there was, so, you know, if you want to think about was this kind of WWE infused, there was lots of parts where, and this is more around the kind of original documentary, where they wanted to show that WWE had progressed, was a trailblazer, was a leader.
Yes. Yes.
And there was so much framing going on that was kind of crazy. So they talk about concussions. And they basically race through the Chris Benoit story. You know, they don't even talk around, you know, they show a little bit from the tribute, but don't acknowledge the fact that they knew beforehand, or Vince at least knew beforehand.
Right.
Brian Jarrett said they knew as the show was going on, but that's not accurate. And you have Dave.
Yep.
But they play down like the diving headbutts having an effect on CTE. And, you know, which is crazy because we've got people like Dynamite Kid and Harley Race. And you've got Hogan talking about, you know, wrist lock, which is just so crazy. And then you have Chris Nowinski comes in and he talks about how they funded him. And that's helped with his research and that they stopped the kind of the chair shots to the head and certain other maneuvers. And he was brought in to speak to the talent. And then, you know, they don't acknowledge, you know, they don't talk about how he was told that he had to stop speaking out against WWE in a way that he was talking about the NFL and around the NHL, and also that they weren't allowed to investigate any more WWE wrestlers' brains after they had Benoit and I had shown, you know, he said the worst CTE he'd ever seen, and then to undermine this narrative of we did something better to improve the industry. You've then got Stone Cold saying, I'm not a CTE guy, I just don't believe in it.
Right.
And then you've got this thing with The Undertaker where he says, you know, I got concussed 5 minutes into my match with Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 30. And I went to the hospital and Vince McMahon left WrestleMania to go to the hospital. And Vince, in the most ridiculous thing ever, and if there's anybody that ever believes this, like, you got to tell me who it is, because I can't believe anybody would, said, it could have happened, but I think Mark just couldn't remember because it was too traumatic for him. And what he meant by too traumatic was that he had to lose his streak. Yeah. It was too traumatic for him to use a predetermined match that he completely lost the memory of 25 minutes of the match. Like, and this is the person that's going to judge, you know, responses to CTE, responses to concussions.
But this whole section to me felt like an partial excuse in terms of like why the wrestling itself got more boring. Right?
Yeah,
like
maybe.
The wrestling itself got more boring, but we had to do it because we were being safe, right? It was sort of, they paired it so much with that kind of like, we had to be better because of the advertisers. Not because we cared about, right. Not because we cared about the wrestlers, not because of it, because we had to grow the business because we had to care for the advertisers. Mm-hmm. And like, so that just felt like a piece of that to me. Like the wrestling's more boring and the shows aren't as interesting nowadays, guys, but it's okay because we've limited CTE, right?
Yeah, no, and there was other things like that. It was a bit around schedule where they talked about how it used to be 7 days a week, 52 days a year. And now, you know, the schedule's not that bad and they've got shots of Triple H talking to talent in the background. And I was just like, this might as well be propaganda at this point. Right. You know, and there's a time where Bob Costa says, you know, wrestlers as a group were often exploited, you know, as past tense. these wrestlers were not unionized and didn't have medical protection. And I looked at it and I was like, well, 1 out of 3 isn't bad, right? I guess. Yeah. At least we have medical now. And then, like, Cody Rhodes proclaiming that he came into a drug-free WWE in 2007 when he came in. The Benoit death was 2 weeks previous, and there was a drug bust on the Signature Pharmacy in Orlando in August 2007 that included 20 names of WWE wrestlers. Come on now.
Not even that, Trish. Look at fucking some of these people now. Like, I'm not trying to, again, I appreciate that there's advances in medicine and everything else, but everyone in WWE is natural. Like, give me a fucking break.
Yeah, Randy Orton's gone some insane, yeah, okay. But it's that thing of that alternative history, and the other way that came out, which is very relevant to kind of things that we've been talking about this week, was around race.
Yep.
So you had this bit with The Rock where he heavily defends Vince, and he recalls back to when he was named. He was told he was going to be WWE champion, and he said, or WWF champion as it was at the time. God, I sound like the documentary. I keep correcting to WWE, what the hell? But he says, I'm going to be the first WWE champion of colour, and Vince had said to him, I know, but I don't see that. And he says, Vince, and I know this for sure, never saw colour. And there's no coverage of the blackfacing with the DX, which, a number of people close to him have said that he wasn't happy with Triple H. There is nothing around Booker T in terms of, if anyone knows the story and everything that went up to WrestleMania 19 or under Vince McMahon. And at the end, they mentioned the sex toys that were in the Janelle Grant lawsuit, but not that they were allegedly named after black wrestlers. And there's this thing where it's like, okay, so we had a black wrestling champion in 1998, but it just kind of illustrates how far behind the rest of the world wrestling was at that time, and still is. Yeah. Because there is still an issue with African American wrestlers in WWE. And, we've got this upcoming pay-per-view where they're in Atlanta, Georgia, and there isn't a male black wrestler on the show.
Nope.
And Jay Cargill and Bianca Belair are hosting.
Yep.
And this is a city where population, currently a 48% African American population. And, this is kind of a continuation of our discussion a couple episodes ago around market value. Because, Swerve Strickland talked about this week. I think you've got the comments on that.
Yes, and let's not kid ourselves, Trish. It's not like we talked about this 2 episodes ago. It's not like these black wrestlers are getting have been getting opportunities, and this is the one they're left off at. And again, I understand that Jade and Bianca have been doing matches on pay-per-view as the tag champions, but. The statistics speak for themselves. So, yes, Swerve talked about this week. He was on The Breakfast Club. They asked him about WWE. They asked him about his time with AEW and his contract. And there were 2 things he said that we both thought were very interesting. The first one is the one that he retweeted several times yesterday. And this was a discussion about, it started off with a conversation about football. So this is a quote from Swerve. They invited me and AB to the Apollo Theater to watch the unveiling of the evolution of the black quarterback. And Roger Goodell was there. I'm watching Michael Strahan on stage, Michael Vick, Jalen Hurts, all talking about the evolution of where they went, all these struggles that the black quarterback went through. Coaches in the league and the infrastructure really thinking that the black man was not capable of playing quarterback because they're not smart enough to call plays and do these things. He shouldn't be paid this wage. He's above market value. And I'm listening here and I'm thinking, man, there was an article here about a month ago about me getting my new contract, one of the highest contracts in wrestling, and I'm paid above market value. These 2 things are like 50 years apart, and we're still having the same conversations. So that's what AEW is beautiful for, and that's why I'm proud to be there, because we're shaking the foundation again like they did 50 years ago. We're doing it now with pro wrestling, and if I have to be the person to do that alongside Tony Khan, and we stand strong, I'm like, no, that's our world champion. That's the leader of our company at this moment, and he's going to be the face of the franchise for years to come, and I'm riding with that. And the contrast to what he talked about, he also talked about WWE and the complaints. And he said, this is another quote from Swerve, they only complain when a black person gets paid. I will say that. We shake the foundation of things like that. Like, oh snap, wait, that's not what we would pay, then why are you calling me? Why are you asking me? If I'm not your concern, then don't worry about it. Don't worry about my pockets and our money. We're good. You have your talent. You made your decision with me 2 years ago. No hard feelings from me. I keep it moving, and I'm going to figure my way out, and I'm going to build myself up. Now, if Swerve had agreed to go to WWE after this contract with AEW, and he wasn't unhappy with his contract, and they did pay him a shit ton of money, do you think WWE would be releasing information that he's getting paid too much?
Of course not.
Of course not. They're just doing it because they fucking got rejected. But I also think it says something about the fact that, like, you know, he's right. And we talked about this. There's no complaining when fucking... I mean, there was a little complaining when Okada got paid, but not to the degree... He's also not white either, let's say that as much. Like, it's just... This is a level of ridiculousness. Swerve is worth every fucking penny that he's getting paid. And the idea that you're not going to pay somebody market, quote-unquote, market value? Like, fuck you! Like, deal with the fact that there's another wrestling company in town and you got to up your offers. I don't know what to tell you.
And that's the sort of thing that would, you know, have you be forgiven thinking this was a WWE production at times.
Yep.
You know, the whole middle of the series feels like rewatching the WCW docs from WWE in the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
And, you know, although they received no production credit, they haven't promoted the show at all. I don't think they will. And I've been trying to establish whether they were involved in the start in production, and it's kind of hard to find those details. So hopefully that's something we can come back to. But I don't think... looking at it, the WWE would be too upset with this right now, because I think it really helps them to reinforce that narrative of Bad Man Gone.
Yep.
And, you know, and frees that up for them in terms of Netflix.
Do you think, so one of the things that I've seen get a couple of people touch on this, and I don't know that I totally disagree with it, but
okay.
do you think that this documentary served as like a soft pilot for Raw on Netflix?
Yeah.
Like a soft launching point of like,
yeah.
you know, here's the entire history of WWE. You may have heard some bad shit, but you don't have to worry about it because that bad man's gone, and now we care about women and black people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a soft pilot in terms of kind of monitoring interest as well. Marketing, yep. You know, this is a thing that's on billboards 2 roads from me on the boards. So it's definitely something that they've used like that. So there is a use for it for Netflix, and there's a use for it for WWE, and I think you can see that in the product to me. What I do think has been good though, so, you know, we've had very few reviews from mainstream media. Yeah. But I thought that the media coverage from, especially some of the sites with more historians in wrestling, so, you know, Todd Martin on Torch, who I thought was fantastic. We listened to 3 of the Observer radios that had good content in it, and the Post I watched the John Pollock, Brandon Thurston one with David Bixman yesterday, and that was also very good. I'm sure there's others. There's so much content, I have not got to everything. I'm going to be absolutely completely honest, but I do think that those that can offer insight or have that kind of depth of knowledge have really tried to do that on this subject and to kind of make it as accessible as possible for people. Yes. So I thought that was pretty important. So, you know, we talked lots about the media in a bad way, but yeah, I was very impressed with some of the coverage this week.
Yeah, I thought that the podcast that Dave and Garrett did were very good in terms of discussing it. I thought, I said this previously, but I thought Garrett had a good sense of what the themes of the documentary were.
Yeah, he was very spot on.
Yeah, which, you know, good for him.
We'll be back on your back on Friday. Don't worry, Garrett.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, back to you. You did have 4 super chats. Yeah, you had 4 super chats. So, you know, win some, lose some. God.
I can't handle it.
No. In terms of response from, you know, the people involved, so Vince McMahon did put out a statement the day before where he said that it was a misleading account and they tried to use it as evidence that I am in fact Mr McMahon. And I think that was kind of a bad statement to put out because it just encouraged more people to watch it. And I think if you do watch it, even with all the kind of things that are kind of that WWE narrative, there's still going to be things where you go, what the fuck? Yeah. So, and he's under a new PR firm now. You know, he's with Edendale Strategies, having left Citric and Company 5 months ago, which coincidentally was 5 months ago is when they released that article around him bringing back puppies and kittens for his family and friends.
So over the top that even the PR people were like, no, we can't do this.
Yeah, so either they can do it or he was like, what is this? Because they all laughed at him. Whatever it is. But yeah, that's a kind of an interesting little bit of timing. But the thing that I got from his words and from most of this documentary really is there's still no acceptance of responsibility of anything. No. There's no accountability, there's no regret, there's no fault for any victims at all, whether, it be things that he's been accused of or things that have happened within his company.
Yep.
It's not present in a documentary. Even down to something like Taker's concussion. He couldn't even take accountability or responsibility for that. And I found that was, that's what really kind of stuck with me. In terms of kind of why this is still important, I think it's kind of important to say that for a lot of people, this will be the first time they see these things.
Yes.
We are so much in the weeds in that regard. We are so much in terms of, it's the same when we did the punk thing. How many people didn't know half that stuff? You get so used to it because you hear these stories and we're so bombarded with kind of news 24/7 that we don't always take into account when these things build up or the kind of longevity of something or the actual impact of something. And sometimes when you put something together in long form, it's much more kind of impactful.
Yeah.
And you see this all the time. I was watching the very raw scandal around the Prince Andrew interview with Emily Maitlis, who is, journalist that I think is fantastic. I was watching it, there's one on the Postmasters versus the Royal Mail in the UK as well. And I thought about this, like especially with that one, because when I watched that one, I did that thing. And there's this thing around, especially in 18 to 34, around kind of nostalgia, where you then go and explore the subject.
Yeah.
So I did that. I didn't know actually anything about that story. And then you go in and look at it. And there will be people that do that. Yes. And not just kind of people that do that, but you have to wonder whether that will lead to anyone else doing that. Will people start asking the questions about what exactly is in the policy and procedure changes that Shawn Michaels talked about in NXT? Where they talk about the Lesnar contract deal that was mentioned, and is that related to why they're now signing deals with TKO? Will they talk about the position of women corporately in the company, in training and creative? Are we going to start asking those questions now because of this? Is there going to be other potential productions that come off the back of this? Is there things that were, pitched or perceived that are going to look at the success of this on, in terms of viewership, or look at the issues that come up and think, well, we can do something else with that. Maybe that dark side of Vince is maybe still out there. So it's one of those things where, it might be good for W for now, but it could come back. It depends on the follow-up and what people will look into. But I do think that long form and that it's accessible is important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you have a lot of people who are, and I've seen this, folks, guys being like, well, my wife's interested in this. She wants to watch this documentary. She doesn't know as much about wrestling, so she wants to sit down. I know a lot about this, but I'll watch it with her, right? So I do think you're going to get people who are going to be like, what the fuck? So, but again, I also think that requires more thorough investigation of these topics, which I'm extremely pessimistic that will happen.
That's fair. Have you got any final thoughts? Any other thoughts? No,
I think it was we did talk a lot on this one, but I think it was both better and worse than I expected it to be, and the response has been both better and worse than I have expected it to be. But I think still unexplored and still ungrappled with is the impact of having someone who is this fucked up and his proclivities were this fucked up be essentially the person who, quote unquote, created your industry or molded your industry. And I think that wrestlers and wrestling fans would be better served by looking at what wrestling is and what they think it has to be and what they think it should be versus what it could be. Like, don't allow wrestling to be defined by this fucking freaky garbage old man. Like, if you get into a place where you're like, well, it has to be like this, why? Ask yourself fucking why. And if it's because it always was like this or because it was like that in WWE, think about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yep, I think that's enough. Okay. So it's always hard to move on to something.
It's so difficult
lighter.
transitioning out of something like this, right?
Yeah,
Like, what the fuck do you do here?
We don't. So
like, we're awkwardly going to move on.
We're just going to move on. Yeah. Okay. So keeping with WWE, something that we have kind of watched with interest this week has been the kind of the spat between WWE and Fox.
Not just interest, but a little bit of glee as well. Every press release is just beautifully spectacular, whether it's, the unofficial cheese board press releases from WWE or the official Fox press releases, which are just, as our friend Evan said, it's like the WBD press releases, but they're written in venom. And I've enjoyed that very much.
And, Fox are kind of gentling activity then, like to WWE. It's like, oh, we didn't just release our press releases. No. We went to sports journalists on Twitter and we did it. We went to, outlets like proper outlets like Sportico, and we talked about kind of not only the benefits of them in terms of ad revenue, and correct from last week, I think we made it sound like carriage fees weren't a part of Fox, but what we actually meant was that one of the main reasons that SmackDown left Fox was not being able to generate ad revenue. So just make that correction.
It's true, but we've done that thing where we jump into a topic where we haven't explained the topic to other people. So essentially, what is going on, right? So let me explain what's going on for those of us. I know, right? We're in the fucking bubble, Trish. You and I exist in the bubble, and periodically I'm like, wait, the bubble. So what's happening right now, right? So a couple weeks ago, Fox has ended its relationship with WWE. I don't believe that it's officially ended until the end of this month, but as of right now, Fox is no longer having WWE on their programming. They're not on Friday nights anymore. They were going to bring college football in and move SmackDown to FS1, and and USA said, we'll take SmackDown early, and Fox said, great, please do. So Fox is no longer airing WWE Wrestling SmackDown on Friday nights. It's on USA. And Fox has for the last 2 weeks, and this is, please forgive us because this is Sunday, so we have not received the third week, but for the first 2 weeks, Fox has gone out of their way to publicly tout how much better their ratings are with college football than it was under wrestling. And they haven't come quite out and said WWE sucks, but it's been the subtext of every fucking press release they've had. And it's kind of insane how aggressive it was. To the point that this weekend, WWE pushed back by releasing the Fast Nationals for Friday night to their, little, sadly, growingly dwindling army of, keyboard warriors, people who are, even vaguely associated with the media. So Alfred Kanua and I think some other rando that they've got now doing it were essentially quick to point out that Fox's WWE was better in the demo than the Fox
college football.
The college football thing.
Yeah.
But even that, it seems like that's, again, you're basing it off the Fast Nationals, which we know for a fact are effectively not particularly good. And I think there was some technical issues associated with one of the broadcasts that might have been impacting it. But yes, so it seems very clear that Fox is not happy with WWE and has not been happy with them for some time, and are now going out of their way to, like Trish said, not just release this shit on Twitter, but speak directly to sports journalists, sports business journalists, and talk about how much better their ratings are now. It's pretty impressive.
I love some of the phrasing as well. Some of the stuff they gave to Sportico, I had them right. If nothing else, early results suggest that Fox is unlikely to regret punting away the pricey WWE showcase. And then it's there's some great stuff on this, and it's Fox struggled to monetize a 2-hour block. According to media buyer estimates, the average cost for a 30-second spot on the show last season was around $53,000 a pop, a figure nowhere near in keeping up with the show's deliveries. And then they actually talk about, football delivering already $15,000 more per ad than WWE, and the fact that effectively they're not paying for this. No. Which they are, because there's a $7 billion deal with 2 other networks for college football. But they are just putting something into a slot that they had access to anyway. So they are just going at it. And then to see WWE go, we'll have to use our Twitter men now, was very, very funny.
The best they could do at pushing back at actual sports business journalism is the Twitter men.
It's, what's Fox's version of, Big Fox's version? We call them Big Fox, don't we? Big Fox. Big Fox's version of Gentle Activity. Because this is it. And I tell you what, it's just very interesting to see someone else win a press war.
Yeah. Yeah. It's WWE are not fighting with AEW over this. They are absolutely fighting with Fox, and Fox is like, fuck you, we're going to beat this. So this argument and this fight is very interesting in the context of a bunch of motherfucking rumors that have been swirling for the last week or so about potentially Fox being interested in an AEW show, right? Mm-hmm. And we talked about this, I believe, at the end of our last episode, and I think we were both very quick to be like, well, this would clearly be on FS1. But the rumors that have come out over the last few weeks and the things that are going on in the background would suggest that maybe that's not entirely guaranteed, and there might be a negotiation between Fox and AEW for a show on the Fox network. And this was brought up, the rumors came a bigger this weekend because Swerve said on the Queen's Flip YouTube, they were videotaping him and they overheard a conversation he was having where he said, we're about to get on Fox because SmackDown's leaving Fox and then we're taking Fox. TNT, TBS, and Fox. We got all three of them things and Tony Khan lets me do whatever the fuck I want and he owns the Jacksonville Jaguars. So this is a thing where this has caused a lot of excitement and drama, and I feel like phones have been going off and people have been going crazy because even Dave Meltzer, God love him, is really pushing to talk about how stupid this would be and how Fox would never do this, and yet it's possible. I don't think Trish and I are completely convinced of this yet, but there's enough noise around it that it cannot be ruled out, and it has to be considered as a serious possibility that Fox would... and let's face it, right? For all the shitting on it that Dave does and everything else, right? Like, part of the big issue with Fox's problem with WWE was that they paid them $250 million a year, right? For what they were assured was going to be a 1.0 in the demo. And as we discussed in our last episode, they never even fucking came close to that. And they were pissed. There was a lot of discussion about the sports presentation they were promised, and Ronda Rousey's going to be on the network. And then they opened up, I think, with The Fiend was the first show on. Right. So, we had a Firefly Funhouse, which God love Bray Wyatt. I'm not trying to shit on that. If people really enjoyed it. But I think the Fox Network guys were not happy with it. And then, we had the whole discussion about, like, Fox really wanted them to hire CM Punk back, and they were desperate to pay they even offered to pay CM Punk some of the revenue, and Vince said absolutely no fucking way. And so that didn't happen. And then Punk did eventually come back, and he's been on Raw this entire time. They didn't really have him on SmackDown at all. So there's a lot of questions in here about like this relationship, and I definitely think it would be interesting. I think if this is the case, you could argue that for a significantly less dollar amount, AEW could provide them with the kind of ratings that they'd be willing to accept. Now, there's a lot of questions about that, and there'd be a lot of issues associated with, is it an A show or a B show, and yada, 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 and how would this work with the network and all that other stuff. And I think there's times where you could say, a confidence level that this would be great, but there's a lot of noise around it. But it's something to keep an eye on, and it can't be ruled out. And I know that the stuff for this weekend would be, I think this week we could see potentially an announcement about AEW's deal with TBS and TNT. There's a lot of rumors that would be coming out on Wednesday. So if that's the case, we'll discuss it in our next episode. But
yeah, we'll know shortly. We'll let everyone do their immediate takes, and we'll wrap it all up.
We'll go in with the deeper dive as we usually do. So.
Yeah, I don't know about the episode. Sorry, Rich. I don't know.
But yeah, we'll see how that goes. So that's something to keep an eye on, and it's sort of fun to see what happens on Monday with regard to these numbers. So
yeah, one thing that is happening this week is NXT debuts on CW this Tuesday in Chicago, going up against the vice presidential debate. Get your cats at the ready. See, I keep making two jokes. I don't know if I'm making eat the cat jokes or I'm making crazy cat lady jokes. It could be both, Why
not? Why not?
America. You have a go at my food, okay?
I'm not really complaining about it.
No. But one of the things that kind of has been discussed recently is kind of the value of the NXT deal. So NXT signed a deal for $25 million a year, which was a 1.7 increase or 7% increase on their previous deal, which was interesting because every time we had reporting on the deal before this deal came out, and it looks like that was around $50 million. It was kind of in the $25 to $35 to $40 million range. So there's this huge overinflation of the value of NXT during that time. But when you look at it, these numbers look like they're trying to grow the product. It's a sign that, of success in terms of having that sort of increase on its standalone.
Yes.
And, this is a period of time where media rights globally are stalling in a lot of places. And I think that there's definite reasons why it holds the value it does, or why it doesn't match value of other shows. So, we're seeing their ratings compared to Dynamite and seeing, well, why is this being priced at that? And then why is these estimates being thrown around at Dynamite? And I think there is a big thing around the USPs for NXT are a lot less. So it doesn't have a unique audience.
No.
It's a third brand for WWE. And, Tony Khan's made recent comments where he's talked about how AEW have got market share and the kind of spend of their audience. And I don't think you can show that for NXT. So I think that's a more difficult place to come from. And there is a hope, they could have low priced themselves as well in order to get that kind of product on linear television.
Yep.
To kind of bring people in. You accept the lower value in a hope of capturing additional audience. And you're seeing a lot of brands do that worldwide at the moment. So it's that hope of having that investment, because they're recognising that, the days of just TV numbers going up and up and up and that being the complete basis are not there. So you have to have marketing, everything else coming in. But they're also not a flagship show.
No.
You can see they're trying to change that. So have you noticed the marketing for NXT doesn't include WWE in any sense?
Yep.
Yeah, and if you look at the USA ads for this fall, now that they've got Raw and SmackDown, they're talking about how they have all WWE content. And this is because, second and third brands are so much easier to drop. And we've seen it. NXT got dropped in the UK at the start of this year by TNT Sports. Secondary, we have the flagship, it doesn't matter. And we see it also with AEW, in Canada, Collision and Rampage are on a streaming service where we have the flagship, right? We have that. And I think that really does affect its kind of market value, and it's something that kind of Netflix go after. And there's this thing around, that's why you have to kind of bundle as much as possible, because broadcasters now either want all the content, like Netflix is doing globally with WWE, or they're happy to pick and choose a part. So that makes the kind of third brand much more difficult. So that's why they're kind of trying to rebrand themselves as a flagship on the CW. But that will have affected their value in these media rights negotiations.
Right.
And it also, with CW, there's an opportunity to do something that can illustrate the value further in cross-promotion. So when they're on USA, if USA wants to promote something in line with WWE, they're going to Raw.
Right.
Not going to NXT. Whereas if you can see the value difference in AEW, they have Shark Week, they have House of the Dragon. I'm sure you can think of other. What was that Texas Chainsaw thing?
Oh yeah, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Was there a Chucky one too? No, that's NXT did the Chucky ones.
Yeah, so they got a few, but it's mostly
right.
WWE main brand picks that stuff up. So you have to prove yourself as a brand. And I was talking to someone about this week, which is why this has kind of come up. But when we're talking about the value of these NXT rights, you have to prove yourself as a brand over a wide period of time. And that isn't just TV rating, that's an ad buys, obviously a huge part of it. But, and carriage fees as well, in different regards depending on the service. But you also have to prove yourself as a brand in terms of what you can offer in partnership. And that's a huge differentiation between the two. And, I got a couple of good sports examples as well. So you look at Formula One, right? Formula One, sport that's huge in Europe, huge in Asia. In America has often struggled to get a foothold. And it's not a legacy brand. It's not something that's had viewership for 20, 30 years. And when they signed it, they signed a 3-year deal. So when we're talking about AEW potentially signing a 3-year and an option, it's not that unusual for brands that haven't had a long legacy. Yes. So they signed a 3-year deal in 2022. It's going to be up next year, 2025. They signed a deal for, what are we on? $85 million a year. $255 million across 3 years. And that was mainly brought up because for the fact there was competition, which there wasn't for these NXT rights. There was competition for the rights from Amazon, NBC, and Netflix. Their previous deal was $5 million, which sounds insane because they were doing 1.2 million for $5 million a year each week.
Yeah.
If you want to look at the value ratio, it's massively, massively different. But then you've got something like NASCAR, which is going to generate, $7.7 billion for its next contract, $1.1 billion a year. So, and there's times where if you put them on the same time, they can deliver similar demos. But F1 is not a brand that has that legacy. So as much as it's hot, as much as it can do, it can do Raw ratings on a regular basis. But because it's not something that's always been good, and there's still that kind of fail-safe as we don't know if it's plateauing or what its worth is going to be. So that thing about legacy is really, really important in these things. And, you have to define your value across those kind of 5 years. And then, the other thing I'd like someone to ask questions around the NXT deal is how much of it is cash, media rights fee, and how much of it is production?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's another good example of that. So the NWSL, the Women's Soccer League in the US, they announced a $60 million per year deal. I was listening to someone this week that called it, toxic positivity in the way it was covered, because they didn't break it down. But that $60 million a year is not a cash fee and media right. It's split down. So there's marketing spend, there's production, there's airtime, there's a media fee. And the media fee, like the actual rights fee, is $25 million. And it's still a huge increase because the previous deal was $2 to $3 million. But it's like the production fee is a huge, huge part of that. And we see that in wrestling. And I think that's why you're already talking about, it's not coming out of the Performance Center. It's going to go back. So they're going to do a couple shows. They're not selling particularly well. Chicago's at 6,000, moved 100 in a week as of Friday. And the St. Louis show that got kind of moved is still at 1,300. So there isn't this excessive live demand on the road anyway. And that reflects something else. So when you talk about how NXT is going to do on CW, I don't know if the big kind of wide things, if they're going to start beating AEW every week. I'm not sure I see it.
Well, let's talk about that in terms of the last couple weeks, right? So they've been bumping up NXT with main roster stars.
Yep.
Punk's been on NXT pretty regularly, NXT, and they've had a couple of other folks come down. Again, nobody at the level of like a Becky Lynch or anybody else, but they've had other folks on it, and they've not been able to break a .20. They've been at best .19, and that's the longest they can do. They have not been able to beat Dynamite, despite the fact that they're clearly throwing everything they can at it to beat Dynamite. So it's clear that there's an expectation, because we've seen this the last couple of weeks. Dave Meltzer's been repeating that, WWE expected NXT are going to make $1 million. Dave is saying they're going to start beating AEW regularly. That seems like it's something he's getting from somebody else. That hasn't happened yet. Right. And, the fascinating part about all of that is, you'd think, again, we're going to Chicago. They've sold 6,000 tickets. Right. Here's the sort of like, is this where some of the softening is happening? They couldn't do anything in St. Louis. No. NXT as a brand does not have the same value as WWE as a brand does, clearly, because WWE, SmackDown, Raw, those are able to sell out. Those are able to sell better, even right now with some potential early softening signs. So I think there's something to be said about, has NXT just started a growth phase, or have they hit a peak of what their current growth phase is? And I think
you look at it year over year. Last year when they were loading up with main roster, Becky Lynch was doing .27s,
right? And
now they put CM Punk in it as a .19, and that was against Becky was against big competition as well. So I think there's an overestimation on how much value they will gain from going to CW as a linear station.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
It's worth 3 million more in terms of homes available, but it's so much less kind of prolific than, USA. USA is so much more accessible. It's all integrated. Will they lose that benefit of the 9 o'clock turnover that they get on USA? And we've seen different movements. Look at SmackDown. It's got a low lead in. They're going to have that with CW as well. So, and you're going to lose your overrun.
Yep.
And the overrun's something that's been institutionalized with NXT since it started, because their benefit of in competition with AEW was they had the overrun. So they trained viewers to turn to that overrun. And they're not going to have that now. So, you've got to look at what the value is this year of that. And, we look at NASCAR's quite a really good comparison point to WWE this year, because they have split between the 3 in terms of linear and cable and streaming, and they're moving their main series to Amazon next year, so they're a good comparison point. But they had their NASCAR Infinity series in the early stages. The numbers are very similar to what you'd see on a Friday night on FS1. So there's no, and we're still very early on this, but we're not seeing like a defined increase or benefit of going to the CW in that regard. Yeah, that may grow because they're getting, they've got NASCAR coming on there, they've got college football, there's a possibility for growth, and they're going to get stronger cross-promotion from those brands than they were from USA. But there isn't a huge amount of people that watch this channel in general. So I do think that there is an overestimation to that. And you know what, as I say that I feel this way, and seeing as am I 3-0 for bets this year? I think I'm 3-0. Okay. 3-0, okay. I'll have a bet, right? So, you're going to get the first couple of weeks. They're putting Sexy Red, who was probably the most successful guest star. Not a WWE wrestler, funny enough, was the most successful this year, was Sexy Red back in June. They're putting her on the October 8th episode that goes head-to-head with AEW and Orton's wrestling. And I'm pretty sure CM Punk probably wrestles Trick Williams on that show as well. But it's, they're probably going to have weeks where they're strong. But I will say, but at the end of the year, and we'll do this by averages, so I'll do demo and total viewership, whatever you want. Okay. I do not think that NXT, over that period of time, to the end of this year, will outdraw AEW. Okay, that's my bet. We'll keep an eye on it. I will wear the worst Triple H shirt anybody can find if I lose this one. There you go. Someone made that suggestion in Discord today, so we'll do that. But that's my bet. I think that's wrong. I think there's an overestimation on CW here.
Yeah, I agree.
But there's been a lot of kind of signs of softening in some of the ticket numbers that we pointed out months ago when we were looking at the immediate kind of on sales, and now kind of has been picked up. I think Dave picked up on them in the Observer this week. Things that we've been looking at for a few months, but it's interesting because it comes at an interesting time. So Roman's kind of in and out, but then you're going to have Rock and Cena coming back, and they are going to kind of correct that temporarily next year, and that will give them more power. And then that kind of leads to, there's going to be some interesting power dynamics, with
it's going to be a good time
Cena
backstage in WWE. Let's face it. Come on.
There's going to be lots of jostling for positions. You're already seeing it with this thing in Atlanta where they can't decide what their main event is.
Right. They can't decide what their main event is. You're seeing it with Cody going nuts about his merch numbers every time Roman's on SmackDown. Like, oh, hey, Roman's back. Guess what? Cody's got the top number 5 shirts and Fanatics. Like, okay. Like, you think about how bad this is going to be when you have these guys fighting for the slots on WrestleMania, which, again, Trish, you brought up the very good point that there's 2 nights. It's going to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, they got 2 nights SummerSlam now as well.
Yeah.
So. But
it's you're gonna have a bunch of guys. You're gonna have an odd man out, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody's gonna be feuding with poor Seth Rollins.
Hey,
it's gonna be interesting to watch.
Leave myself alone.
It's going to be interesting to watch, folks. We could have a very interesting winter and fall, especially if the SmackDown ratings start falling more and they do end up dropping into like a .30 series. Mm-hmm. Are they going to start to protect Raw? Especially because that's, and I don't know. We'll see how it goes, but there's some interesting possibilities that could pop up in the next few months over on the WWE side. So
just attacking
Trish, I think we have to go to our questions.
Yeah, you're just attacking my WWE special little guy now. There you go. Right. Okay, yeah, we've got plenty of questions. So
yes. So I do think the first one we want to talk about, it's not so much of a question, but we got a spectacular letter from Erin, who talked about her experience at the Dayton Collision. And I just want to thank you, Erin, so much for sending this in to us, because it was such a great breakdown and such an in-depth look at the live show experience in Collision, and a show that we had talked about in terms of not getting, having maybe less wrestlers of a high on the main card that were appearing at this show. Trish, I don't know if there was anything specific in this that jumped out at you. I think the main point for me was, how Erin was able to talk about a lot of the criticisms and reiterated a lot of them in terms of not enough promotion in the area, which she feels is ripe for more wrestling and people being, devoted to wrestling. But also saying that despite all of that, the live show experience was still a hell of a damn good time, and she had a great time at the show.
Yeah, I think you sort the other side out, because once someone's in the building, they'll think about these things before and after. Yep. Once they're in there, they want to have a fun time.
Yes.
This is a time period where WWE are running less house shows, so you can create a market. And I know she spoke about the they spoke about the loss of the independent scene in that area.
Yep.
And I think that's a key thing because, US independents are struggling. And there's a struggle for talent. There's such a vacuum straight away for young talent as soon as they go in, whether it be to Japan or TNA or to WWE or to AEW. So it can fill a void. I think that's not a great way to talk about it if you think about how important independent wrestling is. But it can fill a void in that experience for people. But yeah, we just thought it was a wonderful email, and it was it's always good to have kind of your perceptions challenged, and also just to read about something like that. So, yeah. Alright. Shall we start on some questions then? We've got loads this week. What happened this week? We all went to the question bank, guys. What happened? Chris Ellis asks on our Discord, how do you see WWE salaries going over the next decade? What trends do you see emerging? How could this affect other companies throughout the world?
So this is a tough one because I think we all thought when TKO bought WWE, they would start to bring salaries down. And that doesn't seem like it's been the case necessarily. But I do think that odds are you'll end up in a situation where you are paying your top people a nice big high dollar amount. Like there's big money in it for the top of the card, but your lower card, I think they'll continue to do what they have done, which is that the lower card wrestlers and the sort of back of the house people will get paid much less money overall. Like that's where that money will come from. That's my gut telling me on that one, Trish.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the only other the big factor is competition.
Yeah.
So the amount at the top especially will be driven up by how strong AEW is. And that really has been the driving force between both companies for wage rises in the last few years. So that's why a strong media deal for AEW is incredibly important for the health of the industry as well. So.
Yes.
Right. Next one. God, I sound like Jeremy on Keeping It Strong Style. He does it better though. He's so much more professional. This is from, and it's funny because it's from Rambo and Slam Pig, and he always asks great questions on Kiss. So, not sure if this question connects or not, but I wonder how much of the strain in the relationship between TK and the various members of the Elite during Brawl Out and afterward has contributed to their decentering at times. They have had times where they are, individually or collectively, presented as a big deal, but other times it seems like they are almost an afterthought, unless or until they get some sort of organic fan reaction to something they are doing that becomes unavoidable, e.g. the swerve feud with Hangman, the best of 7 blowing up via the NBA W meme, etc. Or is this inconsistency just normal up and down cycling that Elite fans are over-scrutinising?
I say one and it's going to be accused of it being the other. I think that, listen, people's relationships are people's relationships, right? And I think one of the problems that we, as people who view things from backstage, you set in stone something that is always alive and changing, right? Your relationships with anybody change constantly for the most part. So I think you could say that this is the case for probably every wrestler in the back, that their relationships with Tony Khan impact the way that they're booked, and affect decentering and all that other stuff. I think you can probably point to certain instances where, educated guess-wise, you can say that has happened, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that it is a stretch or a challenge to say that that has been something that has happened at AEW. I think you can just look at the product and chart the dates and see it, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's difficult. I think one of the challenges with talking about backstage and talking about people's relationships is that these things do change. And sometimes I think as wrestling fans, we don't always recognize those things. And you hear worst case scenarios and you hear, this person fought with this person, but you don't hear they made up. Unless you're watching All Access and you see Sammy and Eddie have the conversation.
Yeah, it's a complex one. And, it's better now. Obviously, you can see it's better now than it was. And we talked about Kenny last week. We talked about that quite a bit. So, and the Bucks this year, it's been a complicated one. So he had a big focus at the start of the year. The stuff in the middle was messy, whether it be to creative or injuries or anything else. And Paige is Paige. Such a cop-out, but page is page. But I do think, there's issues in terms of time and elevation and focus in general.
Yeah.
And it's not just the elite, but I still maintain that, for AEW to progress, I think it's important that you celebrate your own history, and they are a fundamental part of that.
Yeah.
Got to go with that. That's a very diplomatic answer.
Nice job. We did a good job on that one. Good job.
Good job. They're not getting easier.
No, they're not. So I am the Dave on the Figure 4 wrestling board. Asked us a question. Thank you, Dave. What influence do you think New Japan's most recent golden era has had on American pro wrestling, and how much of it do you think is led by the wrestlers rather than the promoters? Obviously, it led almost directly to the formation of AEW, but has had enough penetration to influence WWE to a degree as well. We saw Bryan Danielson outright leave the company because he wanted to work with New Japan, even if it took ages to do it. Moxley's been open about how much he loves it, and I think there's a fair few WWE talents still around who either like the style or were heavily influenced by it. We've seen greatly increased interest in Japanese talent as well, from WWE signing Nakamura and trying to get Okada and Takeshita, plus others. Plus, there's Stardom, which has had a fair few people picked up by WWE as well. It seems like going to New Japan Pro Wrestling is a genuine stepping stone to the too big two for an American wrestler now. What do you think caused that trend, and has it been a good thing, as nebulous a term as that is? This is a very good question, Dave. I think that this is a question, that influence was bigger at one time. I think it's waned a little bit, although I still think it, in terms of like the wrestlers, the wrestlers place a tremendous amount of emphasis on it. I think, I always think about that in terms of like, what's your favorite wrestler's favorite wrestling? And I think for a lot of them, it's been New Japan. I don't know if I can say right now that having, I know you talk about people wanting to go work there, and if you go work there, it's an automatic step up into an American promotion. I think yes and no. I don't know. Sure, you probably have a better thought process on this one than I do.
I don't know. It's, for me, I think the big thing around what happened with Japanese wrestling was that it became so much more accessible, just as at a time where WWE was struggling.
Yeah.
That ability to have it streamed, and anytime you make something more accessible, the easier it is to grab that content when that content's good and it becomes a viable alternative, which is what happened here. And then you had, people coming through that, like Kenny Omega is just such a key person, that aspect.
Yes.
In terms of, sometimes it feels like it has less of an impact because there's so much centering currently around kind of the Ring of Honor stuff, and I think you can see where the makeup has changed in AEW. That there's still, especially in the main event scene, there's still lots of people heavily kind of impacted by Japanese wrestling, whether it be style with someone like the Young Bucks or Dragon Gate. Swerve talked about his influence from Dragon Gate as well, or storytelling, the way that Kenny Omega tells stories, or the way that Adam Page tells stories, or just that kind of strong style, which kind of really is the difference between WWE Dean Ambrose and AEW Jon Moxley. So in top talent, I think it's more around the talent. In terms of promoters, you see a lesson in that, which sometimes can come from TV wants, what the network wants. When you have something as strong as WWE, there is sometimes a push for media to replicate. So you have to deal with that influence. And then also, as they've had more WWE kind of talent come in and WWE trained talent, then you're seeing those kind of styles and those kind of storytelling changes. But I think they're still a key part at the top of the roster. But I would say it's more wrestler driven. And I think some of it is around now, you don't have the strong independence to develop on. And if you go so quickly to WWE or to AEW, you're going into developmental, or you're not gaining that experience. And look how quickly people can develop when they go to Japan. I think people can see that. So you look, even Anna Jay has had that tour in Stardom. We saw it with Jack Perry, especially for promos early in the year with his tour in New Japan. So there is a benefit of the structure of how that works, where you are wrestling practically every single day, and you are cutting promos every single day, and you're experiencing different cultures and the challenges that it kind of involves. That is different, and now that that's more accessible, especially because the yen is down, etc. that as it's more accessible, then it's a better path for development, and it is an easier thing to be watched from. Yeah, so I think there is an element of that, and Japan is kind of becoming what the independents were for America in the last few decades. I think that's where that transition has felt like, and it's not great in some ways that Japan is now not on the same level, that it's seen as kind of a developmental sort of thing. But yeah, I do think it's kind of replaced the American indies in that role, and that's why we feel like that.
Let's see. I think we may only have time for one more, Trish.
Oh,
I know. You pick.
We will hold some.
We will hold the ones we didn't get to.
So I apologize for that, but yeah, we will hold some. I'm gonna go all the way down to the last one. So apologies if we didn't get to your questions this week. I have got them. We have got loads of them. I will hold them. We will get to them next time. The Vince stuff took up more than we anticipated. So last question comes from Chris. It's seems to have been lots of talks this year about sticking to the plan or riding what's hot. Example this year being Cody Rock WrestleMania 40 and Hangman Danielson at All In. Question is for both Trish and Sarah. How do you handle a situation where a hot act is beginning to overtake the original plan? I know it is scenario based, but just want to know how you all felt. I can't say y'all, don't take the piss.
No, that's how you all.
Yeah. Also, is there any data that shows sticking to a plan was a better business decision instead of the hot act? Keep up the great work, and I will purchasing merch to rock at work. That's very weird, but thank you very, very much. Yes. I can't get used to that. No. But yeah, there you go.
So I think the non-negotiable most successful last couple of years riding what's hot has to be Sami Zayn and the Bloodline, right? I think you could possibly argue that kicked off a lot of their hot period and got people really invested in that storyline.
Did they ride what's hot though? Because they didn't go with Sami.
They didn't go with him, but he sure as shit got a lot more TV time than I think the original plan was. Do you think he was main eventing in Montreal in a singles match with Roman Reigns if that storyline didn't go where it was?
No, but do I think that capitalized on what he could be? I don't think so either. No. It's a complicated one.
It's a complicated one, but I think you could argue that it was a more successful, like, hey, we're at least including the fact that the audience wants this rather than just saying the Vince-esque fuck you, I am going, they did go with Cody and Roman, but they rode that pony for a little while, right?
Sure.
But this is a difficult question, right? Like, how do you decide, okay, because you have to then determine, like, you have to basically ride your gut. Right? The audience is going to be with this, they're into this, they're ready for this the whole time. And we talked about this with the Danielson and Swerve versus Hangman and Swerve, right? And how you figure out whether or not this is going to be worthwhile. And I think some of this probably comes down to long-term planning versus moments, right? Like, is this... I don't know. You go first. I'll argue with your point rather than try to make my own badly.
So, I think there's two bits to this. Three parts to this, actually, I'll say. So, Sami Zayn is a good example. So, you have something like that, you make a choice, and then you have to get the audience to trust you that what you give them instead is of a similar value.
Yes.
And that's what they did momentarily with Zayn before they moved him back down, was they gave them, the audience, that moment of triumph, that reward for the investment by having him and Owens win the tag titles at WrestleMania.
Yes.
And they've done similar with LA Knight, where they moved him up. He had the title match with Roman. He should never have won it. Great. But then we've given him I think it's a US belt. It's got a US belt, isn't it? Yeah. Now. So we've given you we are still invested in this person. And we've given them something. And yeah, it's just a trinket, whatever. But it's about the audience trusting that you're going to recognise this. That they can trust what you're going to do with that performer. And, they tried to do that with Bryan Danielson with Daniel Bryan, and it didn't work. So they did the thing with WrestleMania 29, sorry. 29? No, 31. I was right, 31. Where they chose Roman over him, and then they tried to give him the belt, the ladder match. And yet it still destroyed their main event like 2 hours later. So it doesn't always work, but that is about audience trust. In terms of ones that have been financially successful, a couple of examples that I could think of that are debatable as well is, so Cena and The Rock over Punk being involved in the main event in WrestleMania 28 and WrestleMania 29. And, hugely successful matches from a live gross perspective and from a pay-per-view buy rate perspective. Did they set WWE back when these people disappeared and it was just everyone else, and because Punk wasn't elevating that? Possibly. But if from a financial standpoint, you could absolutely argue that one. And the most obvious one that ruins fucking everything for everyone because everyone uses him in the wrong way is Tetsuya Naito. So Tetsuya Naito loses at Wrestle Kingdom. They do the Okada Omega Series and Omega Draws, huge business through his run to Wrestle Kingdom. And then they eventually put the title on Tetsuya Naito at Wrestle Kingdom 14. And it, Double Dash draws a huge gate. It's hard to judge after that because of COVID, and he can still pull in the biggest crowd in Kobe today with no knees, by the way, in 5 years. So, but...
I love a good Naito defense.
But the problem with Tetsuya Naito is that it's now created this thing where it's like this unusual amount of trust is put in a booker when they, aren't following up on someone properly or they aren't elevating them. And that doesn't mean having to have a belt, by the way. I can't get this through to people queer enough.
It's when we talk about elevation, no one's talking about a fucking title. We're talking about the placement on the card, how much time and energy, how much promotion, all that stuff. Like, I think that's one of the things that I'm finding most frustrating lately is people are like, oh, well, you just don't like this because so-and-so doesn't have a title. No, that's not the fucking point.
And who they're wrestling, right? So Tetsuya Naito doesn't have that belt for 2 years. But he has mid-card belts, but in big programs. He has a series of matches with Kota Ibushi. On the big shows, he has prominent single matches all by himself.
Right.
He's in solo single matches. Keep emphasizing how important that is to be on the big shows in solo matches. They are the big spots. That is being pushed. That is being pushed more than some things that other people consider. In Dominion or Wrestle Kingdom. Wrestle Kingdom, he wrestled Chris Jericho in the year in between. He's not in some battle royal or like non-advertised. He's in key spots, key promotional spots. He's at the front of their, posters and promotional material. They're behind him on merch. That all helps. It's all part of it. And because they held off for 2 years, everyone now thinks that you can just do this long build and you don't need to invest in anybody and it's fine. But that's not what New Japan did. And it's the biggest misunderstanding that really pisses me off because it ruins everyone else's expectations now. And sometimes the bookers get away with not following up. And it's that not following up and not converting people that loses you in 18 to 34. That leaves you a stagnant roster on top and not feeling fresh. And that's been the same. You can hear it. If you watch the Vince doc, you'll hear Mark Calloway talk about it with WCW and WWF back then. It's the same thing. It's the same trend. And we let people off because Naito is this perfect example. As much as I love Tetsuya Naito, it fucking aggravates me because now it's like everything's fine when it's not. So, because that's not what they did. They did get behind it, but they did it in a different way and they were business successful. So that's probably the best example and the worst example. Sorry, that was a rant.
I feel like we can't... I'm going to be honest with you, Trish, after a year of podcasting, I don't feel like Naito can be raised where there will not be some form of rant, but I'm fully here for it, and I am supporting you.
Thank you. It was better than me ranting about last night's Collision, so... Yeah, we don't need to...
We almost got through the whole show!
We don't need to. Watch the match, tell me how that's going to follow up, and tell me if CM Punk or Drew McIntyre are going to be feeding with The Miz afterwards. I don't think so. Right, anyway...
At least The Miz is fucking young.
Yeah. So it's going to be a busy week. We're fully expecting your announcement this week. Coincidentally, Punk's got a podcast on the same day, so it's
weird.
Nice. Yeah, it's nice to know that it's not just elite moments that we come for now. And then it's quite a busy 2 weeks coming up. There's a pay-per-view for WWE this weekend. Wrestle Dream is in 2 weeks. We really are in the final countdown probably for Danielson's title reign so quickly. There's a title Tuesday.
So successful.
And when we come back in 2 weeks, we'll probably have a new IWGP champion as well, with Destruction and Ryogoku coming up in 2 weeks on Monday. So yeah, there's a lot going on. God, that was a lot. There was a lot today. We will get to the questions we've missed next time. I do apologise.
Yeah, we're sorry about that.
It was just
we
a time
want to make sure
constraint.
We try to keep this to 2 hours.
Yeah, we're not going to kill producer Leah, and I don't have any book stuff content to bribe her with this week, so need to work on that better in future. So this has been the Trish and Sarah Wrestling Podcast. We are proud members of the Social Suplex Podcasting Network. Please come and join and listen to all their great shows, whether it be through your favourite podcast provider or through the website. You can also join our Discord. It's an interesting Discord weekend. Lots of Fox images, actually. We had lots of Fox images yesterday.
Many pictures of foxes.
Yeah, but you can ask us questions in there directly or just interact with the rest of the hosts and wrestling fans. You can now also buy our merchandise. I'm not going to do good at these reads. I'm going to need like at least 3 each. Jeremy will be just doing this on Monday. He'll be like, yeah, and I'll be like...
He was so good at it. He was so professional.
He's just an ace.
You know, I just feel extremely awkward. Like, I want to... Every time I'm like, buy our merchandise, I want to be like, but you don't have to. Like, don't feel pressure. That's not good.
Go and buy a Tunnel Talk tumbler instead.
Please buy a Tunnel Talk tumbler.
Go and buy, she's great to host. Go and buy a Tunnel Talk tumbler, because I just love that idea as well. Like, yeah, turn the shit people say around back. I love it. It's fucking great. Anyway, yeah, you can buy our merchandise. I'm not going to be any good at this. You can go to chopped hyphen I'm British tees.com/social suplex, or if you want our direct link. I went and found this earlier because I thought I'd be good, really not. You can go to same website /Trish and Sarah. That's weird.
Good job. You did a good job. You did a good job.
I didn't. And I think we should also thank Martin from Poison Runner, because that really set this up when us and Tunnel Talk guested on his charity stream for the Maddie Cusack Foundation. So thank you very, very much. It's really good to see a lot of the women's teams up and down the country last week observing the anniversary with a minute's silence or minute's applause. But yeah, thank you very much, Martin. How things turn into other things is just very weird. And if you do buy merchandise, and thank you to anyone that does, this is my request, okay? So when I was a kid, I used to love like the football programs, and there'd be a page, and it'd be like, where have you been in your shirt, right? Or your hat or your jacket. And I always like where was the weirdest places? Someone would be like scaling a mountain and like, why are you doing this? But I love that. Like, it's just a little thing. So, if you do, send us a picture of whatever you're doing in your life. We can give you a shout out on here. We can just talk about it. But just for me, just personally, because I'm sad and I really like these things and I can't believe this is happening. So yeah, I just wanted like a little football program. Like, here's this person in we got friends in Chile. You could take it to your football stadium, right? I think it's lovely. Just send me it, because that's just it will make my year, honestly. And apologies if you did watch the stream that I had a very laggy stream. I was very much Dave Meltzer. I know this is a joke that I'm Dave Meltzer now, and I don't know if it's a joke or taking a piss, and I don't really care. But my internet went very Dave Meltzer, so apologies for not being more involved on that. You can contact us. You can email us at trishandsarahpod@gmail.com, trishandsarahpod@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Trish and Sarah. You can find Sarah at Sarah Grabs. If you want to find me, just message me in some way and I'll come on. I got too into an issue of news agents and just don't like Twitter.
I respect it.
I'm enjoying my peace. It's lovely. But yeah, that's where we are on social media. We're back in 2 weeks, expecting to discuss AEW Deal and all the pay-per-view developments. Once more, just thank you to producer Leah for looking after us once more. We'll be back then. So until then, thank you very much for listening. I've been Trish.
I've been Sarah.
And this has been a Trish and Sarah Wrestling Podcast.